views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Open BXRx, BronxNet's special coverage providing you the latest information that matters to you during COVID-19, the coronavirus, and now through civil unrest and social justice actions taking place nationwide and here in the Bronx. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, and today is Tuesday, June 30th. Coming up, how does the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Bronx tie into racial, social, and health inequalities? We'll speak to a doctor to learn more. Then, Community Action for Safe Apartments joins us to give us an update on tenant rights and the recent rent freezes during COVID-19. After that, we'll discuss Pride Month and learn how the Bronx Defenders LGBTQ Defense Project is supporting the Bronx LGBTQ community. And are you interested in creating a film within 48 hours? The Bronx Film 48 has an indoor film challenge just for you. So please stay tuned. Open BXRX starts now. Welcome to Open BXRX on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, inviting you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. As we know, the Bronx has been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic. And while age was a major factor in COVID-19 deaths, neighborhoods with high concentrations of Black and Latino people, as well as low-income residents, suffered the highest death rates. To help us understand how and why COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the Bronx, a local doctor recently wrote a piece breaking down the often forgotten relationships between systemic injustice and health. Joining us now to discuss is Dr. Vanessa K. Ferrel. Dr. Ferrel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So first, to start off, I just want to learn more about you and your work here in the Bronx as a doctor.
Sounds good. So my name is Vanessa. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I'm a medical doctor, public health professional. I moved from Southern California to the Bronx 2 years ago after graduating from med school to do a postgraduate training in internal medicine. I love being in community with the Black and Latinx people like across the borough, and I believe that our shared identities really allow for a more holistic and accessible patient-doctor relationship. That being said, I do recognize my position as an outsider who's living in the Bronx and how my presence as a physician can be kind of a double-edged sword for Native Bronxites. As an activist, I firmly believe that health equity and intersectional justice are goals that we should be seeking kind of perpetually in order to optimize the health and the lives of our communities. I believe in people power and I believe in community power.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for your transparency and for bringing that up. I wanted to ask, in the Bronx, we have, of course, the highest asthma and diabetes rates. In your powerful piece for Left Voice titled Structural Violence, COVID-19 in the Bronx, you broke down how social determinants and environmental racism relate to the existing Bronx health crisis and the highest rates of coronavirus. Can you please help us break this down a little bit more?
Yeah, no problem. So as you mentioned, I recently wrote this piece in Left Voice, basically just about what it was like for me as a Black doctor to treat kind of this explosion of COVID-19. So in the piece, I examined some core themes of structural violence like racism, capitalism, xenophobia, white supremacy, and how they perpetuated the devastation here. I think that racism and capitalism invariably go hand in hand as culprits of high rates of asthma, diabetes, and other chronic medical conditions in our communities, both here locally and nationally. And given that this is a respiratory pandemic, I'll kind of start with disparities in asthma. And so may or may not be widely known, but the Bronx has the highest rates of both teenagers and adults who have ever been diagnosed with asthma. And I think that there are different levels of just structural violence that contribute to that. So part of it is like the physical environment. So thinking about how the I-95 and the I-87/I-278 just kind of course through the Bronx and connect multiple parkways and highways and allow for like diesel trucks and other cargo trucks to carry materials between other cities and states, and seeing how like this increased traffic generates air pollution where these trucks are going from like industrial plants that like line the South Bronx, and increase exposure to different pollutants, including PM 2.5, which is fine particulate matter, as well as ozone. And that exposure in and of itself creates conditions that make people more vulnerable to developing asthma. And it also contributes to the difficulty in controlling asthma, to the extent that, like, on average, twice as many emergency department visits and hospitalizations are experienced both for children and adults that are attributed just to these disparities in pollutants, the PM 2.5 and the ozone. And I think, like, moreover, the fact that these freeways are kind of interrupt like residential spaces and outdoor spaces is absolutely not accidental. A lot of it even has to do with like this early 20th century practice of redlining, which designated 80% of the borough as either definitely declining or hazardous. And so for people that are unfamiliar with the practice of redlining, it first emerged as a predominantly like fiscal practice wherein these like residential security maps were generated, basically to classify the riskiness of giving like money as in bank loans or mortgage loans. And they were color coded based on the neighborhood as like green to red as the riskiness. So inevitably, neighborhoods that had a higher proportion of Black people or immigrants received lower grades, indicating that like loaning money was very unadvisable. And so even beyond like urban planning and redlining, more Bronx residents report like vermin infestation, including cockroaches and mice, compared to other places in New York City. And I think that that is directly linked to the decades of disinvestment from the state and local governments, who overall prefer to ignore the health and well-being of poor and Black and brown people instead of fixing the problems the system itself created.
Wow. Thank you so much, Doctor, for breaking that down. I know that that's a conversation that we all should engage more in. The fact that our health here in the Bronx is also attributed to other systemic factors as well. And I think that your piece really breaks that down. And I'll definitely provide the link at the end of our segment. But I also wanted to speak about why the fight for health equity and intersectional justice within the health system is just as important, and how these things relate to the current civil unrest of many Bronxites who stand in solidarity with national Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality and police reform movements. How can we tie these things together?
Yeah, I mean, so I think to start with, like, Black Lives Matter, period. And I think that medicine and public health are microcosms of society. And so things like anti-Blackness and racism and capitalism and xenophobia and white supremacy are inherent of the fabric of the profession, the same way that they're inherent in the foundation of society. And so I think that healthcare workers need to kind of come to that realization and accept that. And we've definitely all heard these horror stories of Black people, especially being mistreated or ignored in the clinical setting and having some really tragic outcomes. And I think that, it's fair to say that just as with police violence, there are cases of medical violence that don't make it to the mainstream news, but violence toward Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are all inherently connected. And speaking to police violence specifically, I think we have to move past this idea that the institution of policing can be reformed. The police, as we know them, were founded from coalitions of slave catchers, night watchers. And so it would be really irresponsible to ignore that history and ignore that context, because anti-Black racism is like literally built into the foundation of the institution of policing. So we can't simply reform that. The solution is invariably abolition. And I think that like Black abolitionists have been advocating for the abolition of police, of prisons and detention for so long. And it's really invigorating to see the movement start to turn in that direction. But I fully support the uprisings locally and nationally.
Dr. Ferrel, you also spoke about the Bronx and its historical solidarity against corrupt and racist medical care. Can you help us also visit that topic?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the guiding examples and kind of one of like the examples that I feel most aligned with, and something that I always kind of keep going back to regarding fighting corrupt and racist medical care, the Young Lords, who were founded within New York City in the late 1960s as a Puerto Rican liberation organization that worked closely with the Black Panthers in the interest of Black and Latinx solidarity and liberation. And some of their efforts, especially toward the beginning, centered on Lincoln Hospital, which is in the South Bronx, and at those times was known by many people in the community as the butcher's shop because of how like poorly the health outcomes were for people that were admitted, and how, you know, people either left the hospital worse than they came in or died in the hospital and never left. And so the Young Lords successfully like took over Lincoln Hospital on at least 3 different occasions in 1970. So I think there were a lot of successes within them, and they were often generated as like responses to actions that had happened in the community, or inequity that had happened in the community. And so on one occasion, they issued 7 demands to Lincoln Hospital. On another occasion, they established the People's Program for heroin recovery services for the community. I think that the Young Lords really understood the power of organizing and used their skills to advocate for the entirety of the South Bronx. And I think importantly, they also understood that health was more than just direct medical care or caring for acute illness, which is really evident in a few of their 7 demands, like demanding fair wages for hospital workers, demanding preventative care services, child and elderly care to be offered by Lincoln Hospital, as well as the establishment of a community-driven Lincoln Hospital. It's kind of this idea of community control of facilities.
Thank you. I also wanted to discuss some of the hardships that you face as a Black physician on the forefront of this crisis. How are you trying to balance the equity and disproportionate health realities facing our communities?
Yeah, so I think medicine, you know, as mentioned earlier, is like this inherently racist field and an inherently anti-Black field. And I think it's really challenging to balance that as a Black physician. And I think that there's so many like different levels of racism that like as like going through training and like medical education in school, like what you're taught, the way that we're kind of conditioned to think things like as doctors, this is what you think about Black people, or this is what you think about Latinx people or Asian people or Indigenous people. And that being like tested and standardized tested and just kind of these different ways that this gets perpetuated, and kind of, you know, that being very clear that medicine has like a field that was created by like white people, with the intention of othering everyone else. And this idea of like white superiority that still gets perpetuated in medical research now. And even like things like race as a social construct, which is very well recognized by like critical race scholars, but still within medicine is this thing that like race is a biologically, genetically determined thing that creates inherent pathology or vulnerability in people who you look at and assign a race to, which is, you know, not very scientific at all, but it's kind of like just, it is everywhere within medicine. And so I think for me, something that's been helpful is to be somewhere where my patients look like me and my family members, and kind of keep me grounded in order to kind of counterbalance the like immense othering and alienation that comes like with just being a doctor or being in medicine.
Right. I know that you're also part of a group of healthcare workers who put forward a powerful statement in solidarity with actions against police and racist violence, demanding justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and Sean Reed. Can you tell us more about the healthcare workers' call on the labor movement to take action against police and racist violence?
No problem. So this was a collaborative effort among socialist healthcare workers across New York City, who recognize that racism is a public health crisis and that the police are a threat to public health, and that white supremacy is a threat to public health. So it essentially serves as a call to action for healthcare workers across the country and across the world, to condemn anti-Blackness, to condemn racism, to condemn white supremacy, to condemn the institution of policing. In the letter, we outline our major ideology, which includes We condemn racist enforcing of social distance measures in Black and Brown communities, that we believe healthcare workers are working class and should stand in solidarity with Black and Indigenous-led movements, especially during the pandemic, that we denounce professionalism and dual loyalty, that we denounce worker expendability under racial capitalism, especially under COVID-19, and that we stand in solidarity with actions against racist violence. And so really the importance of recognizing like racism as a common thread within not only society, but in our professions, and how important it is to be activists and stand in solidarity actively rather than kind of this passive, like non-event, in order to meaningfully take action against racism and other forms of oppression.
Is there a fear in the healthcare community to, I guess, go against the status quo and the structure that's already set in place, or the systemic issues that are set in place at hospitals? Is there a fear amongst colleagues that you sense, or I don't know, like some kind of pushback when it comes to these type of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely pushback, and I think that that's part of what the inherent nature of medicine is and why it's so difficult, like so challenging for me as a Black person who's an activist, who's like with radical politics, because all of those things are directly in conflict with the institution of medicine. And so much of like medical education, especially, so thinking about like medical school, like getting into medical school, getting through medical school, going through training, and being successful in academic medicine really require you to like stick to the status quo and not challenge it because of fear that your career can be compromised anytime that you speak out. And so I think that often the like anyone who's kind of on like the like passive side will go toward just keeping things comfortable in order to not make their future challenging.
Thank you. One final thing, Dr. Ferrel, just a message for the Bronx community on solidarity and health.
Yeah, so I think that there is a just historically beautiful spirit of organizing and community care that lives on in the Bronx. I want to particularly shout out two orgs, Take Back the Bronx and La Morada, the restaurant in the South Bronx, who have been supporting the South Bronx, especially during this pandemic. Just kind of these principles of like feed the people, fight the power. I think that we need to continue to hold each other up and to organize against the systems that seek to oppress us and seek to marginalize us. And remember that the pandemic is not over, and the only way out is through.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vanessa Ferrel, for your time today. And definitely shout out to La Morada and shout out to Take Back the Bronx for their work in our community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you. Folks, to read Dr. Vanessa Ferrel's piece on structural violence, COVID-19, and the Bronx, please visit leftvoice.org and type in Bronx. The title should pop up. Open BXRx will be right back. Welcome back to Open BXRx. Here in the Bronx, we're approaching yet another month where Black and Latino tenants advocate for rent cancellations and relief during COVID-19 due to job loss. So far, calls for rent cancellation have not been answered, but the Rent Guidelines Board has recently approved the lowest rent freeze adjustments in the history, and tenant movement has kept the eviction moratorium in effect. What does all of this mean for tenants? Joining us now to give us some updates is Kim Statuto of Community Action for Safe Apartments here in the Bronx. Kim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Kim Statuto. I'm a CASA leader, and I'm also a leader of my tenant association at 1515 Selwyn Avenue, Bronx, New York, 10457. Thank you for having me. Yes, we did get a rent freeze for 1 year, which means they're not going to increase our rent in September or October. And if somebody is opting for a 2-year lease, they'll get 1 year with no rent increase. And the second year, I think it's 1 to 3% but I really believe it's 1%.
Kim, what are your thoughts on the 1% increase in rent, and how will this increase impact tenants currently struggling due to the pandemic?
Well, of course, it's going to affect people. That's if they're opting for the 2-year lease. Hopefully, within 2 years, we'll see this shift change and it won't be that bad. But right now, they won't get a rent increase from, I think it's October until next year, September. If they opt for the 2-year lease, they will get that 1% increase. But right now, and I don't, a 1% increase is not that bad. Not that bad compared to what we could have gotten. But any increase at this time is bad because people are struggling and hurting, and they are not financially stable to even look at an increase yet.
Kim, CASA leaders such as yourself are always on the front lines representing tenants. And most recently, you were at a rent strike and protest demonstration at a Bronx housing court here. What happened there? And can you please tell us about the ongoing rent strikes and protest demonstrations going on here in the Bronx?
Sure. Great question. Monday, we were at Bronx Housing Court because, as you know, Monday, the eviction moratorium was supposed to end. We got an extension until July 7th. Landlords' attorneys were lined up to start filing papers against tenants that haven't paid rent so that they can start their eviction process. They got an extension. We got an extension until July 7th, meaning no landlord can evict you right now. They can start filing again July 7th, but not through housing court because housing court refuses to open until pandemic or health issues are met. So, but landlords are going to have the opportunity to file these papers online. And how that's going to look, we don't even know. Buildings that are involved in rent strike, usually a rent strike comes about when you're trying to get the attention of the landlord. So come to the table and talk to your tenants and find out what's going on. My building is on a rent strike because we're trying to get our landlord to come back and talk to us and let us know what's going on as far as repairs. How is he maintaining the building or not maintaining the building, and hear the struggles from the tenants.
Right. And I also wanted to speak, Kim, about the relationship between housing justice and racial justice. As we said earlier, the majority of residents who lost their jobs are now struggling with their rent, and they're Black and Latino. Can you just tell me about the relationship between the two and like the correlation with the movements going on nationwide, apparently, as well?
Housing justice and racial justice goes hand in hand. Let's talk about tenants or people that are looking for apartments and don't have a great credit score. They're being denied housing because their credit score is not up to par. And the tenant is the landlord is like, okay, well, they seem like a risk because their credit score is not that great. But you done paid application fee, background fee, credit check fees. You understand what I'm saying? And that's a fee that they're profiting off of, and then they still don't offer you the apartment. So it is a form of discrimination against you just because you don't have a perfect credit score. Just because I don't have a perfect credit score doesn't mean I don't pay my rent, doesn't mean that I'm a bad tenant, doesn't mean that I'm going to mess up your apartment, doesn't mean because of the color of my skin, I'm going to be different than the person with an 800 credit score, if you can relate that together.
Right. And thank you, Kim, for breaking down earlier what's going on with the 6-3 vote that the RGB made. I just want to define the RGB for our viewers before getting into the next question. The RGB, as seen on screen, is a 9-member group that is in charge of determining yearly rent adjustments to the roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. They have been meeting remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Kim, I just want to ask, do you expect an increase in cases flooding recently partially reopened housing courts? And what is going to happen next once those housing courts start opening slowly?
Well, right now and again, like I said, we're on hold and pause until July 7th as far as anything happening. Housing courts are not opening. They don't feel that it is safe for their workers to be around crowds of people. So housing courts are not really opening just yet. They've pulled that back. But eventually we're going to be looking at what's going to happen when they start opening. We've made a list of demands on what it should look like besides language justice, health, um, health security reasons. What are you going to do in that aspect? They haven't met those demands yet. So why are you pushing people into a housing court crowded, full of people that could possibly infect others and their communities when they come back? So right now, from my understanding, housing court will not be opening back up just yet, even past the July 7th eviction moratorium deadline.
Right. Thank you, Kim. I just wanted to put the scenario out there. You kind of answered this question already, but I just wanted to put the scenario that I spoke about before. Let's say that I'm a person who has been laid off from my job due to COVID-19. I'm experiencing financial hardship, never heard back from unemployment like many other people. I got one stimulus check to help me pay for food, and I haven't been able to pay my rent. I decide to go on a rent strike. Can my landlord go to court and hit me with back charges, an accumulation of the rent that I haven't paid, and also the current rent? Is that something that will happen frequently, Kim?
That will happen frequently. Remember, we never got a cancel rent. Cancel rent would have ended any type of back payments owed to a landlord. We've only got an eviction moratorium. We didn't get a relief on our rent. Landlords are still expecting their rent, and they can take you into court for back rent, forward rent, and late fees. Um, Services that might be available to help one is social services. But if you have a pending unemployment case, just because you haven't received it yet doesn't mean you're not going to see it. So more than likely, social services will deny the case because they see that you have a pending unemployment case. And they will basically tell you, oh, they're just going to have to wait until your unemployment case is decided upon. And you'll come back to us with word whether it is in your favor or not in your favor. So you're hit with a double whammy. Yes, I'm going to be charged court fees, late fees, and back rent, and any rent owed forward. Exactly.
All righty. Thank you, Kim. Just one last thing. Could you please share any helpful tenant rights for our viewers, things that tenants should be aware of at this time before we close out?
Tactics that landlords are using now and that we're hearing as they're trying to gain access to their tenants' email addresses to send them notices demanding rent. That is illegal. They are not supposed to be doing that.
How can people stay in touch with CASA and also get more assistance with tenant rights?
To get in touch with CASA, you can go to www.casa.casapower. One word, www.casapower.org. Or you can reach Giraldi at CASA at 917-306-3320, or Pablo at CASA 917-753-6996. Also, you can research Bronx Legal Services. They can also answer questions for tenants that are having issues.
Kim, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us and for giving us this update for tenants.
Thank you for having me, and I hope it gives you the information you need.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Folks,
Thank you.
you can follow at Casa Bronx and at Right to Counsel NYC on Instagram for tenant updates here in New York. Open BXRx will be right back.
Who's most at risk for coronavirus? People over 65, people with underlying medical conditions like heart disease, chronic lung disease, asthma, diabetes, people undergoing cancer treatment, and people with weakened immune systems. What should you do if you or a loved one is at higher risk? Avoid close contact with people. Avoid crowds. Stay home if you can. Wash your hands frequently. Learn more ways to protect yourself and others at coronavirus.gov.
Welcome back to Open BXRx. Pride Month is a celebration of the impact LGBTQ people have had in the world. The Bronx Defenders LGBTQ Defense Project is a dedicated team of advocates representing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer residents in legal matters. Joining us now to discuss is Deborah Lolai of the LGBTQ Defense Project. Deb, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. To start, can you please tell us more about the LGBTQ Defense Project at Bronx Defenders?
Of course. The way I like to describe our project is using three different components of our work. So the first component of our work is direct legal representation. We are a team of lawyers and advocates who represent LGBTQ clients directly in a variety of different types of cases, such as criminal cases, prisoner rights cases, police misconduct cases, discrimination, immigration cases, housing, and family court cases. In addition to the direct legal representation, we also work on a variety of policy, legislative, and advocacy issues that impact our client population in all of the systems that I just mentioned. And we try to create policies that both keep them safe when they're navigating these systems, but also ensure that they are as respected as one can be while they are navigating these really difficult and challenging systems. And the third part of our project includes providing various types of training for the community, for city agencies, and other service providers to ensure that the service providers engage in best practices, and also that the community members know their rights when they're navigating these systems and working with these service providers.
Thanks, Deb, for breaking that down. I also wanted to discuss some of the disproportionate risks that low-income LGBTQ members face and how the LGBTQ Defense Project supports and advocates for the community.
Thank you so much. That's a really important question. I would say that in almost every facet of life, low-income LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted. This is a result of both systematic oppression and discrimination, and also prejudice that people experience on an individual level. And I'm sure that you've already heard some of these statistics, but they are extremely jarring. And I'm talking about numbers like 40% of New York City's homeless youth identify as LGBTQ because of being rejected by their families. A large number of youth drop out of schools because of bullying and end up on the streets instead of in school. Nearly all transgender and gender nonconforming people have experienced discrimination in the employment sector and in housing, right? So they're not getting jobs, they're being denied housing because of who they are. And you know, when you talk about these risk factors, all of these factors lead to poverty, right? And so what this results in is a much higher percentage of LGBTQ people, in particular LGBTQ people of color, living in poverty. And we know that poor people, especially poor people of color, are targeted by the criminal legal system. And so it's no surprise that LGBTQ people of color are targeted by the legal system, both because they're living in poverty and also because of who they are, right? They experience disproportionate levels of profiling and harassment and discrimination by law enforcement. So, you know, what we do is we bring that reality that I just described into the courtroom. And we use that as a way to tell their stories and explain how they ended up where they're at and why they shouldn't be penalized for it, right? So not only do we try to highlight their lived experiences in defending them in their cases, but we also try to make efforts to do what we can to assist them in those in their lives, right? And that's sort of the whole idea of our holistic defense model. When we meet someone for the first time because they have a criminal case, it's not just their case that we work on. We work on the various struggles that they may be experiencing in their lives that may be a result of their case or may be what is resulting in them being arrested. So that's the type of work that we do. We try to, we work on both the risk factors that result in people ending up in the system, and also trying to bring light to what people's lives look like, right? And why they look like that.
And I love that that's the process, because sometimes maybe even the client is not aware of all these structural things being put in place to stop them from advancing in their own communities. So, you know, on top of that, the discrimination for just being who they are is just an attack on humanity in itself. So I'm very glad that this resource is here for them. Next, I wanted to discuss, I can't help but reflect on how Pride Month and LGBTQ resistance and the community's history of protests are reminiscent of protests that are happening nationally today. Deb, can you speak to us about the solidarity of the LGBTQ community with current Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality movements?
Definitely. I think this is a conversation that a lot of people are having right now. And, you know, while I think it's a huge misconception that LGBTQ people started fighting for their rights when Stonewall happened. That's just not true. LGBTQ people have been fighting for their rights throughout history, way before Stonewall happened. However, the Stonewall Uprising was the moment in which we started to, as a country, celebrate Pride every year, right? And I think it's important. That's important because the Stonewall Uprising was literally an uprising against police brutality, right? It was an uprising that was led by trans and gender nonconforming women of color who were resisting police brutalization of their lives, their bodies, their communities, right? And that's what we're seeing today too, right? And sadly, while the LGBTQ community has made a lot of progress in terms of their rights more broadly in this country, the targeting of LGBTQ people of color by law enforcement has largely remained the same from the time of Stonewall. Not much has changed, right? And the NYPD continues to profile LGBTQ people, specifically trans and gender nonconforming people. They continue to harass them, abuse them, and kill them. And it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the NYPD. The jails and prisons do the same thing, right? Layleen Polanco, a transgender woman of color who died in the custody of the Department of Correction, would be alive today if she were not transgender, right? She would not have been placed in solitary confinement if she were not transgender. And it's important to remember that, right? Because we need to keep in mind how this movement began. We need to keep in mind who has benefited from this movement and who continues to be deprioritized in the movement. And we need to change that. We need to change the focus of Pride, of LGBTQ rights more broadly, and hone in on the people who are being the most impacted, the worst, the discriminated against in the worst way, whose lives are literally being taken from them because of who they are. So I do think that because of that history and what's happening right now, I think that naturally there is a solidarity that is building, and it's an important one, right? We need to have that solidarity in order to keep this momentum and movement sustainable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Deb. I also wanted to bring up that the LGBTQ Defense Project also fought in the beginning of the pandemic for the release of transgender vulnerable inmates amid coronavirus. Were your calls heard, and are there any updates on this?
No, I would say our calls have not been heard. They have not been responded to. Transgender, gender nonconforming, intersex, and non-binary people who are locked up in our city jails and our state prisons continue to be the most targeted. They continue to be the most at-risk population within the jails and prisons. And not nearly enough is being done to ensure that they are released. We have clients who are in their late 60s, who suffer from chronic medical issues, who are transgender, and they are still sitting at Rikers Island. And, there are so many nuances to this issue that might not be as apparent to people who are not entrenched in the system. And because they're not so obvious, right? So for example, the sort of incompetency of these agencies result, and not just incompetency, also discrimination, right? And violence in which they process individuals also results in this. So when a transgender person goes into custody, there's often a big question about where to place that person, right? And as a result of that, they're often moved around from unit to unit, housing area to housing area, facility to facility. And that results in them having contact with way more people and way more spaces than a cisgender person would, right? Solely because of who they are or how they're perceived. The other issue is that people are nervous right now. Incarcerated people are nervous, and that naturally results in an uptick in tension and uptick in violence. That coupled with the reality that many correction officers are not coming to work because they want to keep themselves safe, understandably, means that there's also less monitoring in these facilities. So the people who are the most vulnerable to violence are the ones who are going to be preyed upon. And that is almost always transgender people, especially transgender women who are currently locked up in men's jails and prisons.
It's really hard to move on to a more positive side of things in the movement, but for the sake of time, I have to continue on. But hearing that is just heart-wrenching in and of itself. So thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to ask about a momentous civil rights law that finally protects gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination. This is, of course, a great victory for the LGBTQ community, but the fight for equality and rights is not over. What's next, Deb?
I think one of the most beautiful parts of this moment in history right now is that it gives us space and an opportunity to vision a world that we may have not been able to envision previously. And so I think we have a lot more work to do, and it's already happening, right? But you're right. The recent victory was so crucial, and it was actually transgender people who were on the front line of that case, and who made that happen. So again, right, we see transgender people leading the way for the benefit of the larger community, but we cannot forget who continues to be forgotten, right? I say this all the time. It's great when laws are passed to protect our rights, but actually it doesn't end there. What happens next is even more important. Those laws need to be implemented. People need to follow those laws. Employers need to stop discriminating against trans and gender nonconforming people. And when they do, they need to be held accountable, right? And so that's sort of the next step in this specific regard, but we have a lot more work to do across the board, right? Our LGBTQ immigrant population are suffering right now. LGBTQ people of color who are living in poverty in New York City across the board are suffering. We need to do things that directly impact transgender nonconforming women of color, like decriminalize sex work. There's a bill right now on the state level that would decriminalize sex work or repeal a certain section of the penal law that would do that in part. And people need to know that kind of thing is happening, and we need to be pushing for it. So there's a lot more work to be done, right? We and it's inextricably tied to the larger uprisings that are happening in our country right now.
Thank you for that, Deb. Just before we go, how can the community reach out to Bronx Defenders and receive support and also donate to the LGBTQ Defense Project?
Well, we have a 24-hour hotline. If you have an issue that you think you would benefit from talking to an attorney about, the number to that hotline is 347-778-1266. You can call any day at any hour, and you'll be able to speak with an attorney. You can also email our project directly at lgbtqdefense@bronxdefenders.org. And if you want to donate to the Bronx Defenders, you can visit our website at www.bronxdefenders.org, and you'll see a donate button right on the website.
Thank you so much for your time today, Deborah, and for the wealth of knowledge that you provided us today.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Folks, for more information, please visit bronxdefenders.org and follow at Bronx Defenders on Instagram to stay in touch. Open BXRx will be right back.
Why should young people care about the spread of coronavirus? Well, we know that people with underlying medical conditions over the age of 60 are at highest risk, but they've got to get it from somebody.
So we're asking everyone to be selfless for others so that we can protect those who are most susceptible.
Not going to bars, not going to restaurants. It all just means physical separation so that you have a space between you and others.
For more information on how you can social distance, please go to coronavirus.gov.
Welcome back to Open BXRx. BX Film 48 is a Bronx film initiative seeking to create a safe and vibrant creative space for all filmmakers in the Bronx. They have an exciting challenge coming up, and they're inviting you to create a film indoors in just 48 hours. Joining us now to discuss the second annual Bronx 48-Hour Film Challenge and more are Ayaris Perez and Edwin Torres of BX Film 48. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. So to start off, let's just learn a little bit about BX Film 48. Tell us the initiative, about the initiative, the mission behind it, and all that good stuff.
Yes. So basically, the Bronx 48-Hour Film Challenge, we started this last year, really inspired by the 48-Hour Film Project, which is usually held in like Brooklyn, maybe sometimes Manhattan, but figured traveling an hour and a half to go to a film challenge is not very ideal for someone living in the Bronx. So it was definitely a problem for me. So definitely we wanted to localize that challenge. We wanted to bring that challenge, but bring it to the Bronx, but also make it our own. So basically the concept is just the same. We're giving filmmakers a chance to write, film, and edit and release a short film in 48 hours, in one weekend. Just one very hyper intense, no sleep weekend.
Right. So this year it's different. You guys have transitioned to an indoor initiative. Can you tell us more about that? What is it? How will it work? And who can participate in this indoor film challenge?
Yes, so our 48-hour film challenge this year will be indoors. And it's something that we kind of we're debating on how to proceed with the challenge this year due to the circumstances that we're in. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and how to proceed with the challenge and still maintain everybody safe. So we decided to do it indoors. It is going to be a virtual kickoff, virtual screening. And it's really, you could use any interior space that you have access to.
Right.
And just using the same different types of elements. So stay tuned for the.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, just really due to COVID-19, like we just wanted to ensure the safety of our participants, like because normally we would have required elements, and one of those elements would be to actually go to a Bronx landmark. You would pick it out of a hat or a bucket and actually go there and film it, so we know that you at least filmed that part in the Bronx. You actually came here to film. But since it's the challenge, since COVID-19, everything's different this year, indoor challenge, we wanted to basically like even the playing field by having it, everybody can film inside the safety of their homes, and it's a citywide competition. So it doesn't matter if you live in the Bronx, you can still participate.
Got
so
you.
it's a challenge on top of a challenge because it's indoors.
Oh, okay, nice. So I also wanted to talk about, on your platform, you use the hashtag Time to Create, and there's a power in film and creativity in times like this of civil unrest and the pandemic as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Just the power of film and creativity in times of hardship that we're going through right now.
Yes, I can kind of jump in on this one. So I think the importance of creating right now, it's super, super relevant because filmmaking in itself, it's such a collaborative process, and it really makes an opportunity for filmmakers or any kind of creators to work together and really influence each other, learn from each other, inspire each other, and it makes room for growth and really learning from each other. And something I was reading this morning that like kind of like brought me some clarity to this question. Actually, it was like no one is really independent. Like we are all interdependent, and we gotta let our art and filmmaking show our humanity. So I think that's why creating right now and during a pandemic, during such civil unrest right now, is really to, share our truths and reclaim our narratives too, like share what we have to say and archiving our voices to really, not even just for us, but for future generations to come. Like this is such a historic moment that we're living in. So, using art as healing, filmmaking as liberating and healing too.
Yes. Oh no, I absolutely agree, and I love that so much. Thank you, Ayaris, for sharing that. Right before COVID-19, the BX Film 48, there was an incredible networking mixer that you guys had, and then the pandemic hit. How has the pandemic impacted your work as a collective? Because I know there are 4 of you, right, behind the BX Film 48 initiative. So you all are still working together remotely, but how has this entire thing just impacted your work and put it kind of like on the back burner a little bit for a while?
Oh my goodness. We got so incredibly lucky, like beyond lucky, to have that space. Shout out to DreamYard's BX Start and Rudy Blanco for having us have that event in that space. And yes, so basically it's so much, basically it all started with like lots of Google Meets, so much Google Meets, so much Zoom, and just really talking and deciding like, okay, like, are we able to still do this? Can we do this? But yeah, it's really just impacting, everything is remotely. Basically, I had to turn my room into an office. And yeah, I just really, I guess like the workflow is like kind of the same. It's just like at home, but yeah, a lot of it was just brainstorming like, okay, how could we do this effectively? Would people even be able to do this? And yeah, really just, because we got a lot of feedback in the networking event, and people still were telling us that they still were wondering if something was happening. So just with that curiosity, we wanted to make sure that people were still able to have something to participate in, and really just to really have a creative outlet, because there's so many stories that still need to be told. There's so many things that can serve as like a microcosm for what's happening right now. I think that what people do, what artists make now could have a tremendous impact on what happens in the future.
Yes, yes. Oh yes, I agree with that. And I also wanted to ask about the impact of COVID-19 on cinema in general. As we know, movie theaters are still closed and film productions are completely on pause. What will cinema look like post-COVID, and how can we support our local filmmakers like here in the Bronx?
Yes, so I've seen a lot of, first of all, I think I've seen a lot of posts of like AMC might not even survive this. Hopefully not, because AMC was one of the only theaters I had access to at Bay Plaza. So hopefully there's still something there at the end of this. I've seen posts where, I've seen articles where people are physically removing chairs from the actual seats in the theater. I don't know how sustainable that would be, but and also drive-in movie theaters are making a comeback. I just learned about a drive-in movie theater at Orchard Beach actually run by Tribeca, which should be cool. But yeah, I think the other end of this, like after when people are actually able to go in the movie theater, I think it's going to be crazy. I think there's going to be like maybe another renaissance, and I think a way to support really to support the local filmmakers happening now is that are still putting out stuff is like just consume their content, your friends' content, like you would consume Netflix or YouTube.
Yeah, I think this time has really. Oh, I'm sorry. This time has really like allowed us to like create, and it's been such a moment for us to reflect and really be able to get our ideas out. So I think there's definitely going to be an increase in the way films are created for our phone. You know, there's Quibi now too. So the way films are going to be distributed and out there, it's definitely going to be, I think, more accessible too. And really just supporting, sharing your friends' content, you know, sending it out to friends that you think are going to be watching it, that it's going to be something good for them, networking with their art.
Right. I'm seeing a lot of quick turnover with projects, filmmakers out on the forefront, recording protests and going through all of these, you know, doing so much during this time and not letting their creativity kind of stifle them, but also lending their craft to the people out on the forefront as well. You know, I appreciate filmmakers out there doing their thing right now and kind of like turning the whole production around on their own in terms of like post and pre everything. I wanted to also bring up, let's go back to the film 48 challenge that's coming up. One important thing that I want to bring up to the viewers, if you don't know about this challenge, it's open to anyone. So even if you don't have experience, the guys here like BX Film 48 are really open to anyone joining this. Tell us more about that.
So yes, thank you for amplifying that. Yes, that's such a great point. It's really open to any age, no experience whatsoever. It doesn't really matter, you know, if you don't have the best camera out there. Like, you could use your phone, you know, whatever's accessible to you. We had someone last year film an entire film with their phone, with their iPhone. So really, yeah, it's open to anyone. If you want to learn a little bit more about our challenge, we just launched our website too. So it has some of the elements that we are going to be using this year, the prices, which are pretty dope. And really, it's just a safe space for you to learn your craft. You know, you can never be failing if you're trying and learning. So this is your chance to do it.
Yeah, it's really an opportunity for people to just jump right in, especially for people. We had a filmmaker last year that never, he won one of his, in the actors in his film, won for best like acting. But he had never made a film before that. So we just want to provide that opportunity for anybody that's really never known or had that push to make a film. It's like, all right, here's a thing, here's a weekend where it's just all, you can just focus all on that. And that's what we want to provide for people.
Right. And the challenge this year is completely free, right, to join?
Yes, free.
Give us all the information that we need. How can people connect with you guys, find out more about the indoor challenge and sign up? What's the deadline?
So basically, we're going to have a kickoff on July 10th. We are going to, so basically, like, in a lot of ways to contact us is basically our email at bxfilm48@gmail.com with any questions. But yeah, so basically, you have to film it indoors in your home. So even if you have like a balcony or a backyard, we're not really allowing that, just to really, make sure everybody has an equal chance to make a dope film. And yeah, there's still going to be required elements. So during the kickoff, we're still going to have people, we're going to use this app called Wheel Decide, where like kind of a virtual spin the wheel and then it'll land on a genre. We're still going to have like people have to pick a genre, and then a line and a prop that we're going to choose, which actually we had a poll for. So now we're going to look at the results for that and actually decide what has to be in your film so that people don't cheat.
Got you. And Ayaris, just like some ideas for a film, like we're all home right now, so you can literally just make a film about anything, but there is a genre that you have to stick to. Can you give us like just one example of something someone can do without, exploring too much into like the plot and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's I've actually never participated in a 48-hour film challenge. This was the year I told myself I was going to do it. So I'm going to put myself in those shoes and pretend, that I will do it this year. I think really relying on your team more than anything, because, nothing works in isolation. So relying on your team and listening for everybody's feedback. Okay, like, how can we make this work? It might be like a genre that I'm not necessarily familiar with, say like a horror movie. Like, I've never done a horror film. So really, I think this is when you rely on your teammates too and figure out how to approach this, because you probably have much more to learn from them than you can.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you both so much for joining us today, Ayaris and Edwin from the BX Film 48 Initiative.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
Of course. So, folks, as you heard, the second annual Bronx 48-Hour Film Challenge will be kicking off on Friday, July 10th at 5 p.m. If you're interested in creating a film, no matter your skill level, you can visit BronxFilm48.com and click challenge to find out more information. Also, follow at BXFilm48 for updates and to stay in touch with the team on Instagram. That's all for our show today. Thank you for joining us on BXRx. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, wishing you and your family safety and wellness now and always. Until next time.